Good to see everybody tonight. I'm so glad you're all here. Yes. Yes, it's good to be seen. It's good to be here. Well, I wanted to tell you about two Louisiana preachers, Reverend Bordeaux and Reverend Thibodeau.
Wait, is that tiptoe?
Thibodeau. I actually wrote, one of my stories has somebody by the name of Thibodeau. I used to know a guy up in Minot, North Dakota by the name of Thibodeau. And I think I used his name. It wasn't his person, but because I think it was a woman, wasn't it? Anyway, something like that. So we had Reverend Bordeaux and Reverend Thibodeau, and they were from Louisiana. And they pastored churches that were right across the road from each other. So one day they were kind of out in one of their church yards, and they were both hammering this sign into the ground there. And the sign read, "The end is near. Turn yourself round now, afore it be too late." So that's what the sign said. And just as, they were Cajun. So just as they just got it finished and they kind of stepped back, this guy came racing by. And he saw the sign, and he had rolled down his window, and he yelled out the window, and he said, "You religious nuts!" And so then he just continued on, and just around the bend, they heard screeching tires, and they heard the guy yell, and all of a sudden a splash. And Thibodeau turned to Bordeaux. He said, "Do you think maybe the sign should just say bridge out?" And again, has nothing to do with what we're talking about tonight. So, but that's all right. We are almost done with the book of Romans. We've been almost all the way through it, 16 chapters, and tonight we are talking about chapter 13 of Romans, and I've entitled it "God and the Government." So that's going to be interesting here for a little bit. Let's kind of set the stage for a moment. Now remember, Paul is writing the book of Romans while he's in Corinth. And all of the known world is under the control of Rome. And all of the known world is under the control of Caesar. Does anybody know which Caesar it was that the world was under control of at this point? Okay, good guess. Augustus? Who? Augustus who? Augustus Little? Little Caesar. I get it. Little Caesar. Little Caesar. Yes. Over here, they were right. It's actually Nero. Now, Nero was one of the most ruthless Caesars. He came to power when he was 16 years old. Now, think back for just a moment when you were 16 and how much you knew and how much you thought you knew. You thought you knew everything, right? 16 years old is when he came to power. And if you kind of read the way that he came to power, it was very underhanded. I won't ask for a raise of hands, but if you ever watched Game of Thrones, very similar with some of the things that went on with that. And so when he came to power, he was only 16. So he was a boy Caesar, basically, and got there under underhanded means by his mother helping him. And some people got killed and some various things. And so there he was, and he was in power. Now, at 16 years old, he had total power. Total power over life and death. Because you've seen the movies, you've read the accounts of the gladiators that fought in the Colosseum and the Circus Maximus, and simply all it took from the emperor was a downturned thumb, and they would be put to death. 16 years old, and this is where he was. And this is the government that Paul is writing about. Nero is the person that later on would burn Rome years later. He was ruthless. He hated the Christians. He hated the Christian way. He, in fact, hated them so much that he was very instrumental in putting many, many of them to death in hideous ways. He lit his gardens with Christians dipped in oil, set on fire, hung on poles. This is Nero. Okay? Now, his Judean counterpart was Herod the Great. Also very ruthless. He was politically driven. He only cared about Rome. He only cared about money. He was in command of Israel at that point. So you have Nero, who is in command of Rome. You have Herod the Great, who is in command of Judea and Israel. And both of them were ruthless, cutthroat leaders. So look at Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. We live in a democracy. Technically, we live in a republic, really. But we have democratic rule. Not talking about the Democrats versus the Republicans. I'm talking about the democratic rule. We elect leaders. We vote for leaders. This was not going on at this point, because this was a monarchy. And Nero had total control over everything. We have monarchies. We have democracies. We have theocracies. Anyway, and that would be God's rule. That would be the greatest. That's true. That's true. That's true. Not all theocracies, thank you. Not all theocracies would be Christian. Yes, exactly. And so we've got that going on. The best form of government actually would be a dictatorship, if the dictatorship was a good dictator. You know, if he was following after God and he was a dictator, he'd probably be all right. So Paul talks about this in Romans 13, and he says, "Let everyone be subject, hupotasso, to the governing authorities." Now, as we look at this here, and we look at all of the different things that are going on, it's kind of very important that we understand that within the context of the church and within the context of our church, you are not going to hear me be politically minded. Okay? I vote. I think that there are certain leaders that need to be elected. Not all of my leaders that I vote for get elected. But we, as a church, as a table of grace, cannot afford to exclude anyone because of their political beliefs. Okay? You might be Democrat, you might be Republican, you might be independent, doesn't matter. Because what we are talking about here is we are talking about higher authority. And we're talking about it in the way that God intended and also the way that Paul says. Okay, so in 13:1 he says, be subject or be in submission to the higher authority. Everyone in life is under submission. You and I are under submission. Before we were saved, we were under the submission of sin. And now that we have come to the Lord, we are under the submission of righteousness. Paul says, let us be under submission to the higher authorities. We live in submission. Ephesians 6 talks about everyone being a slave to righteousness. We are submissive to righteousness. Romans 8:7 says unbelievers are not in submission to God. We have a governing authority. We have a higher authority. When we look at this, let everyone be subject to the governing or the higher ranking authorities. Exousia is the name for the authorities. This is the same word that Jesus used when he said to the disciples, all power has been given unto me. He said, all authority has been given unto me. Exousia. It's the same word. And Paul he goes on and he uses the word for, which is gar, and he says, let me explain, or indeed. So what he says is Paul was notorious for this. He makes a statement and then he says, okay, now we're going to step back and we're going to explain this. And then he makes another statement and then he says, we're going to step back and we're going to explain this. And you'll find this word for and you'll find the word gar many, many different times throughout Paul's writing. That's what he's talking about. And so this is the same thing when we're talking about the higher authority here. Now, we have structures and we have laws. We don't always like those laws. We don't always agree with those laws, but nevertheless, we have those laws in our country. Our country is different than other countries. There are other countries that are kind of the same. We have a democracy. There's other people who have socialism. There are other people who have dictatorships. There are all kinds of different things that go on. And when you look at government, my dad brought back a little paper from World War II, and it was typed with a typewriter, those of you who remember typewriters. And it was the isms of government, and it likened them unto cows, basically. And so one of them was socialism, that said, okay, you have 2 cows. In socialism, you got to give one to your neighbor, right? And then there was another one that was communism. You have 2 cows, and the government takes the cows and milks the cows and then sells the milk back to you, right? Capitalism is you have 2 cows, you sell 1 cow, you buy a bull, okay? So you can get more cows. And then the last one on his list was Nazism. The government comes in, shoots you, takes both the cows. But nevertheless, that is that's kind of a little bit of the different types of governments and things that we have here. Okay, so Paul says, he says, let everyone be subject to the governing power, the higher rank, and the word that he uses here is a military term of lining up. So as we are lining up in submission to the higher authority, this is what Paul is talking about. Okay, so it's a military term. So the higher rank. He says, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Now, remember when Jesus in John 19 stood before Pilate. This is just before he was going to be crucified, just before he was going to be executed. And Pilate basically was feeling his oaths, and he said to him, do you not know that I have the power of life and death over you? And do you remember what Jesus said?
You don't have power unless it was given to you.
Exactly. He said, you don't have any power except what God has given you. You don't have any authority. And Jesus basically said, he said, if I wanted to, I could call 10,000 angels down right now to destroy you. But Jesus understood the greater good. He understood his mission. He understood the way of the cross. He understood that he had to go and die. And he wasn't going to do that. He was constantly telling the disciples, because they would ask him, are you going to set up your kingdom? Are you going to overthrow Rome? And he constantly told them over and over and over again, no, that's not what I have come for. He could have done that. And if he would have done that, it would have made history, but it wouldn't have saved you and me. Right? He could have overthrown Rome and just gone back to heaven, and we would have just been out of luck. But he didn't do that. He understood his mission. He understood his authority there. God is not interested in revolution. He is interested in reformation. And that's the way that we have to think in this politically charged climate in 2022 of our government. And we may not agree with them. There's a lot of things that I just don't agree with. On the local level, on the state level, on the regional level, on the national level, and in the world. A lot of things. But Paul is going to kind of go through and talk about all of this. We look at everything that goes on social media. And right now, I would not want to be a police officer. Because it doesn't matter what you do, you are on display for the whole world with social media right now. And I work with police officers, I work with cops all the time, and they are human beings just like you and me. Some of them are geeks. Some of them are clueless. Some of them are macho, both men and women. Some of them are extremely nice. Some of them are extremely intelligent. But they are just like you and me. And they are out there and they are doing a job. Okay. Let's go back to about 1976 for a minute. I'm playing tag, 1976, but I'm not running around on grass and trying to hide behind trees and various things along those lines, but we were playing tag in cars. And so we're driving around the city of Denver, and we're trying to locate each other and various things. So me and two of my buddies are down on Colfax. My buddy owns a 63 Camaro, I want to say. We loved riding around in it. And so he's driving, and I'm in the passenger seat, and my other buddy is in the back seat. If they listen to this video, they will know who they are and who I'm talking about. Okay, so we're doing that. Now, in the other car were a carload of girls. Some of them we liked. Some of them were just friends. But we were playing tag. We were playing hide and seek, basically, for the most part in these cars, right? So we're down on Colfax and Federal, right around that area. And there used to be a Kmart down there, somewhere around down there. And so they were kind of chasing us and various things. So we duck into this Kmart parking lot. And it's after hours. It's probably 10 o'clock at night. So there's not really anybody in the parking lot. So we go around Kmart. And right as we get around Kmart, there is the loading dock there that kind of goes downhill into the side of the building, right? So we pulled the Camaro down in there and turned off the lights. So the girls are chasing us. They come around because they saw us go into the parking lot. They come around, and they went on around, and they didn't see us down in there. And so they went on around, right? So then we backed out. We pulled out, turned our lights on, and we're starting to cruise kind of around Kmart again, going very slow. And we get around the side of Kmart, and all of a sudden, a police car confronts us. Not only one police car, but about 4 or 5 police cars. And they all converge on this Camaro that we are in the middle of this Kmart parking lot. Now, I've told you before, I grew up in a cop's house, right? My dad was a Greeley policeman for years. He was a Denver deputy sheriff for 16 years. So I grew up in a cop's house. This was back in about 1976. Back then, when you got stopped by the police, you got out of your car to show them that you had no weapons, you were being open to them. And so this is the mentality that I have had growing up in a cop's home, right? So what do? I open my door and I get out. And at that point, I have a shotgun leveled at me. And I'm noticing that all of the police that are around me all have their weapons drawn, right? And the policeman says to me on the other end of this shotgun, He says, get back in the car. And I said, yes, sir. I did. And so I got back in the car, right? So they surrounded the car. What had happened, our dumb luck, was somebody had just robbed Kmart. And it was an armed robbery. They robbed it as the store was closing, and they took off, right? So the cops get there, and the manager's out there. He sees us creeping around the side of the building, and the manager goes, there's the guys right there. They're the ones. And all of these Denver cops converged on us at that point. Now, we explained who we were, gave them our driver's license, explained what we were doing. We were out playing a dumb game, all that kind of stuff. We didn't go to jail. We didn't get locked up. We didn't get shot. That was a good, that was a good thing. So I have grown up respecting authority and respecting police. But I also know that they are human, that they make mistakes. And some of them do bad things. And there are some cops that are bad cops. But you know what is worse than bad cops? No cops. Because if we had no cops, we would have anarchy. There would not be any of us that would be safe for any reason. If somebody ran a red light because we don't have to obey that law, and somebody got mad, they would get out and they would shoot you. And so we would have anarchy. There's a reason why Paul talks about this the way that it is with the government. And there is something that is called common grace. Remember that God said the rain falls upon the just and the unjust, right? There is certain things in our life and in our society and in the way that we do things that happens to everyone. Sometimes we blame it on the devil. Sometimes we blame it on God. Sometimes we blame it on self. But I am convinced, through 63 years of living, that there are just some things that just happen. It's just the way that it is. We are human. We live in a dysfunctional society. We have things that just happen to us that are not providence of God, and they are not designed by Satan, and sometimes they're not really even self. If I walk across the bedroom in the middle of the night with all the lights out, and I stub my toe, or break my toe on something, it wasn't the devil who did it, right? It wasn't Satan who did it. It was just because I am in the middle of the night and I'm half asleep and my bearings are off and I run into the chair, or whatever, right? Some things like that just happen because we are human. So Paul goes on as he talks here. In verse number 2, he says, consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will not be condemned. How many times have you and I said, when we see something on the news, we see something that has happened, or maybe something, here's something that never registers with my brain because of the way that I was brought up. If you are surrounded by police, or maybe a few police, and they tell you to do something, and you come out with a gun, it's not the policeman's fault that you got shot. Sorry. And that is exactly what Paul is talking about here. He says, the laws and the consequences hold no terror to those who are law-abiding. Right? It's when you step outside the law that then things hold terror for you. And that's what he's talking about here. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for the rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They don't have weapons for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities not only because of the possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. Now, think again of the times that Paul was talking to the Roman Christians in. He was saying the madman on the throne is still put there by God. Now that blows our minds. You know, we get up in arms if our party is not elected in America. And we have coups, and we have marauders, and we have riots, and we have all kinds of different things go on. And these things go on in other countries too, if the political power is not in power, the one that you want it. But Paul is talking about all of these things are put together by God. Remember that he said a couple chapters back, everything works together for good for those who love God. As you look back in the Old Testament, and we already talked about this, it was Romans 8, about Pharaoh being in power and keeping the children of Israel in bondage. Yet, God was saying, I'm the one who put Pharaoh there. So, when we look at our government, and when we look at what Paul is talking about here, we have to understand that God will still use somebody even that we didn't vote for to do his will. Because here's the deal. Either you believe that God has your best interests in mind as you serve him, or you don't. And if you don't believe that God has your best interest in mind, then why are you serving him? Right? We have to believe that even if someone is in the presidency, let's just talk about America here for a minute, even if someone is in the presidency that I didn't vote for, I still have to believe that God has a purpose for having him there. Let's go on here. Verse number 6 we don't like.
I don't think you get to pick and choose.
No, I don't get to pick and choose, but I can still not like it. It's okay. Paul says this is also why you pay your taxes. For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Right? The Herodians, who were under Herod, and the Pharisees got together one day, and they thought, we're going to trip Jesus up. And they came to Jesus and they said, is it right in the eyes of God to pay tribute, to pay taxes? Do you remember what Jesus said? Okay. He said, let me see a coin. They gave him a coin. He said, whose image is on it? Caesar. He says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. What was Jesus saying? He said, pay your taxes. Now, let's look at Rome for just a second. This, again, historically, is where we are, where we're looking. We pay income tax, and we pay sales tax, and we pay, various things like that. Here's Rome. In the Roman government, there were multiple taxes, and one of them was called a poll tax. This tax was every male from age 16 to 65, and every female from age 14 to 65 paid a tax. Your next logical response is, for what? And the logical answer, according to Rome, was just for breathing. It was just because you were alive. If you were alive, you paid a poll tax. So you paid a poll tax for everyone that was in your household. Then you had income tax. This was on top of the poll tax. It was 10% flat rate. Then you had a ground tax. The ground tax was for using roads and bridges and various things that the Romans built, which, by the way, have stood now for thousands of years. You can still go and you can walk or drive on roads over there in Rome that were built 2,000 years ago, and they are still intact. But there are certain places around here that you can't keep the asphalt right. Enough said on that. So we pay a ground tax. There was another ground tax on top of that, 10% of what you grew, like wheat or grapes or, something like that. Oh, and by the way, if you grew grapes and you made it into wine, there was another tax that was 25%. So for those of you who like to drink, there was another tax on top of that. So there was 10% on what you grew, like wheat and various things. And if it was grapes or wine, it was another 25% on top of that. There was also a cart tax. And that was dependent upon how many wheels that you had on your cart. So if you had 2 wheels on your cart, you paid a particular tax. If you had 4 wheels on your cart, you paid another particular tax. By the way, don't go fishing, because when you went fishing, there was a fishing tax on what you caught per fish. So, how many of you watched The Chosen? If you haven't watched The Chosen, please watch The Chosen. It is so good. I'm giving it a plug. Watch The Chosen. It's so good. One of the main things at the very first season is about Peter and James and John and Andrew, the fishermen, right? And how they are constantly trying to get their catch in so that they can earn money for their family and not have to pay the tax to Rome. Is it any wonder why it is that the Pharisees said of Jesus, that man eats with tax collectors and sinners? Is it any wonder that as Jesus is walking down the road, there's a little short guy and he's up in the tree named Zacchaeus, and he says, "Come down, Zacchaeus, I'm going to your house to have supper today." And Zacchaeus was a tax collector. And the Bible talks about people murmured and they hated Jesus because of that. And one of Jesus' disciples by the name of Matthew was a tax collector for Rome. And when you've got all of these Roman taxes, the poll tax, the income tax, the ground tax, another ground tax, cart tax, fish tax, was it any wonder why the Israeli people, the Israelites, and the disciples hated Rome and hated tax collecting? Because they were taxed on everything they did. And we complain about our taxes, that if you do your taxes right, you might actually get something back at the end of the year. Right? But Paul says this is also why you pay your taxes. Because we are subject to the higher authority that God put in there. Nero, who killed Christians. Right? Okay. Now, let's go on to 8. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be are summed up in one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Now, let's look at the 10 commandments for a second. So there were 10 commandments. The first 4 were about our relationship with God, and the next 6 were about our relationship with each other. Don't covet your neighbor's wife, don't steal from your neighbor, all of that type of thing, right? So that's what it was. Paul talks about this right here. Jesus comes along, and he says all of the law can be summed up with these 2 things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? All of the law can be a culmination of that. It can all be summed up with that. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. That's the 10 Commandments. First 4, love God. Next 6, love your neighbor. Okay? Okay, so when we look at this, and we look at what Moses said that God gave him, and we look at what Jesus said about this, and we look at what Paul said about this, it is all summed up in those two things. If you love God, you're going to automatically love your neighbor. If I love God and I'm following God, I'm not going to go down to Brian's house and try to steal something out of his front yard. Right? So I am loving God, but I am also loving my neighbor. That's what Paul's talking about. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, let's talk about this self-love for a second. Do you realize that in Scripture, nowhere does God tell you to love yourself? Isn't that interesting? We are in the society that we are in that is full of self-love. You can't love anybody else if you don't first love yourself. We are reminded of that with every airplane flight. Because as we are starting to take off in the airplane, the flight attendants, I almost said stewardess, that's politically incorrect. The flight attendants, what is it that they do at the beginning of every flight? Okay, they give the instructions, and what are the instructions designed to do?
Save yourself, help yourself.
Okay, they are designed to keep us safe, and as they are talking about that, they are talking about those little masks that drop down in the event of air pressure. Now, it's always been fascinating to me that when I'm flying from here to Indiana or I'm flying from here to Iowa or something like that, that they always say, in case of a water landing. There's no water in between us and Iowa, And I'm thinking, is the pilot going to find a big lake to land in, or what the deal is with that? But they talk about that, and then they talk about the mask. Now, when the mask drops down, what is it you're supposed to do? You're supposed to put your own on first, right? And then you can help somebody else. Now, that makes sense. That's according to that. But even in our psyche and even in our subconscious, that is still telling us, save ourselves first. Right? Save yourself first. Love yourself. We as Christians, we don't think that we love ourselves. But we do. We feed ourselves, we clothe ourselves, we put shelter over ourselves. We get manis and petties, and we pamper ourselves, and we hear our people with play dates saying, well, I need a little bit of me time. We have all of that kind of stuff that goes on in our society all the time. It's on social media, all of that. We love ourselves, okay? When Paul is talking about this and when God's talking about this, love your neighbor as yourself, he is not talking about the humanistic logic of self-love. He is talking about a presupposition. He already presupposes that you love yourself because you keep yourself alive. And then he goes on to say, love your neighbor in the same way that you love yourself. Keep them alive in the same way that you keep yourself alive, whether that's physically or whether it's spiritually. The golden rule, we have forgotten about that. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is what Paul's talking about here. Now, when he talks about, in verse number 8, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt of love to one another. People have taken this out of context that says that you are never supposed to get credit for anything, right? And there are Bible teachers that will teach that. You are never supposed to be in debt. except the debt of owing somebody love. For the most part, that may be correct. But there are certain things that in our society and in our age and in 2022 that you can't help but go in debt for. For instance, your house. Sometimes your car. There's certain things like that. Now, what Paul is talking about here is he's talking about don't spend outside your means. Don't get a bunch of credit that you can't pay for, because that's stupid. Benjamin Franklin said one time that creditors have a longer memory than the people who they borrow from, basically. From the lenders. How was it he said that? I guess I should read it. Let me see. Okay, well, I have it in there. Yes, their memory is going to outlive your memory, basically, within that. And so that's kind of what Paul's talking about here. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, the thing that we have to also look at here, and I'll start wrapping things up in a little bit here, is there any time that we should disobey the government and that we should disobey the authority above us? And there are some times when you have to do that if the laws that are imposed upon you go against God's law. There are several different examples in the Bible. If we go back to Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar was the king, and he got full of himself at one point, and he told everybody, I am going to put up a statue and an image of myself out on the plains, and everybody's going to bow down to me. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, no, we're not. We're not doing it. He says, if you don't, I'm going to throw you in the fiery furnace. I'm going to burn you up. They said, go ahead. Because we believe that if our God is able to deliver us from bowing down to you, that he is also able to deliver us from the fiery furnace. And I love that song, Even If. Who is it? Thank you, Mercy Me. Because it basically talks about that. If we go through the trial and if we go through the fire and we are thrown into the fiery furnace, God will deliver us. And even if he doesn't, we're still going to serve him. And that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said. So they got thrown in the fiery furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar came, looked at them. They weren't getting burned up. They weren't screaming with pain. And there was a fourth person that appeared in there. You all know the story. And he said, the fourth person is like the Son of God. Right? Jesus was walking through the fire with them. There was another instance in the New Testament that Peter and John were preaching and came before the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin told them, you cannot preach in the name of Christ. You cannot call him the Messiah. And Peter and John said, is it better for us to obey man or to obey God? So they beat him, they whipped him, they threw him in jail. They got him back out of jail. What did they do? The Bible says the very next day, they were back in the temple, they were preaching Jesus. They got him, they caught him again, they beat him up, they threw him in jail again. This time the angel came, shook the place. They got out again. And it's funny if you read the account, because all of the Christians, all the saints were together and they were all praying for Peter to get out of jail, right? And so God miraculously delivers him, and he goes to the place that they were all praying and knocks on the door, and the little girl comes and looks, and it's Peter. She doesn't even open the door. She just runs back to tell them, yeah, Peter's standing at the door. And what did the Christians all say? You're nuts, right? That was a faith-filled bunch, right? Praying for Peter to get out of jail, God delivers him. Oh, no, you're stupid. That's not true. Well, maybe it's his ghost. They believed more that it was Peter's ghost than they did that God was able to actually deliver him, right? That's funny. Anyway, read the story. And so what happens? It didn't matter what they did to them. They got out of jail. They went right back to it again. They obviously were not going according to what Paul was talking about here. But when Paul was talking about this, he was talking about the governing authorities as long as it doesn't go against God's law. And there are plenty of instances and plenty of times when they talk about that. Okay, so let me see. Okay. So go ahead and stand. So 13:11 says, "And do this, understanding the present time, the hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed." Jesus is coming, and he is nearer now to coming than he was 2,000 years ago. Now, I don't make any predictions of when he's going to be here, because I've lived through those dispensations quite a little bit. And one day is as 1,000 years with the Lord, and so on and so forth. But Paul says here, your salvation is nearer than when you first believed. The night is almost nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light, putting on the full armor of God. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in carousing or drunkenness, not in sexual immorality or debauchery, not in dissension or jealousy, but rather clothe yourself with the Lord Jesus Christ and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. This is the picture of the Roman soldier who gets up in the morning and is in his tunic and various things, and for him going off to work, he puts on his battle gear. He puts on the breastplate, and he puts on the helmet, and he gets his sword, and he puts on the loincloth, and he puts on all of those types of things there. And he puts those on to go to work. This is what Paul's talking about. Marches out to do that. When he comes home, he takes all of that back off. He's back in his street clothes, for instance. Okay? Later on, of course, in Paul's writing, and you all know, in Galatians, he talks about putting on the full armor of God, so that we can withstand the fiery darts of the wicked. We can withstand the things that Satan's going to throw at us. When we are subject to higher authorities and we respect them, even if they are not Christian authorities, we still are honoring God, because God has still put those people in power for a reason. Sometimes it's to draw you and me as Christians closer together. When we look at the things that happened with COVID and all of the rules and regulations and all of the laws that were passed, all of the nonsense that went on, we didn't like it. I didn't like it. I didn't like going to Home Depot and they would only let a certain number of people in and you had to stay 6 feet, and they would, not allow you to go in and, all that kind of stuff, and they would only let you go in one door, and they wouldn't let you check out on that, so you had to get all your stuff. You had to walk all the way to the other side of the building and check out, and then you had to walk all the way to the other side of the building to leave. I didn't like that. I thought it was nonsense. But if I wanted to go to Home Depot, that's what I had to do. I didn't like it, but I did it, right? I didn't like the mandates that were put on us in all kinds of different things. And even the mandates within the gathering of believers in churches. I didn't like it. I understood it. I didn't want anybody to get COVID. I didn't want to get COVID. We have had it, Pretty much all of us have had it. I understood it. Didn't have to agree with it. But nevertheless, God says that if we rebel against it, then it's our rebellious heart that is in the wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't vote. That doesn't mean that you don't write your congressman. That doesn't mean that you don't go out and perform your civic duty or serve on a jury or whatever. Let's take the topic of abortion for just a moment. If we as Christians, if I as a pastor went to an abortion clinic, I can peacefully protest up to a certain point. You know, they only let you go, so close to this abortion clinic, and I am totally against abortion. Let me say that right off the bat. If I go and I do a peaceful protest out on the sidewalk or trying to help young women that are coming in, that's one thing. But if I go and throw blood on people or try to kill an abortion doctor or whatever, in the name of the higher authority of God, I am in the wrong. And here's the interesting thing about that. If you as a pastor do that type of thing and they arrest you and they throw you in jail, do you realize that they can actually tell you that you can never preach publicly again? Now, let's look at this. With the Great Commission, as Jesus sent us out, he said, go into all the world and preach the gospel, right? He didn't say, go into all the world and fight abortion, or fight against whatever the political climate is, or fight against whatever law that you don't agree with. He said, go in and preach the gospel. So if I, as a pastor, were to do that, to try to make a point, and then I am told you can never preach publicly again, or we will arrest you again, we'll send you to prison, for the rest of your life or whatever, have I just thwarted what God told me to do and what God called me to do? And again, I'm not for abortion. But I understand the Great Commission where Jesus said, go into the world and preach all the gospel. And if I take myself out of the game, and if I take myself out of the battle, simply because I'm going to, dances with wolves, stand with a fist, right? And I'm going to stand on my convictions, I am in the wrong. That's what Paul's talking about. He says, be subject to the higher authorities because God has put them there for a reason. Now, we won't go into all of the dictatorships throughout history and through the world, but remember, as Paul's writing here, he was under the authority of one of the worst dictators in history. And yet he said, be subject to the higher powers because there's no power that God hasn't actually placed in place there. You can think on that. It's interesting. Go to, go to the last slide. Keep going, go one more. There we go. Next week in Romans 14, Paul talks about some gray areas a little bit. Except the one whose faith is weak without quarreling over disputable matters. That's going to be interesting. So, anyway, let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you that it sheds light on things and dissects things in our lives. And Father, I thank you for the country that we live in. And I thank you for the laws that are passed to keep us safe. Father, I thank you for our leaders and our president and our Senate and our congressmen. Even though I don't agree with them sometimes on things. Father, I thank you that within all things that you work together for good to those who love you. And Father, help us to understand the difference of being concerned and the difference of being rebellious. And Father, I thank you for that. Thank you for Paul's writing. Thank you for the inspiration from your Holy Spirit that he had. And Father, help us to be good citizens, and most of all, help us to love you more. And I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.